Hey StreakyGeek, how are you?
In the late 80s and early 90s, the video game console market was essentially a two-horse race between Nintendo and Sega. The landscape is very different these days, with Sony dominating and no sign of a Sega console since 2001. But Sega continued to survive as a software company and game developer, with a library consisting of thousands of games. To cover a list of a top 7 Sega games would be a massive undertaking. In the year 2000, Sega consisted of 15 separate development teams all working under the Sega banner. So I've decided to focus on just one of Sega's development teams. WoW Entertainment was a rebranding of Sega R&D 1 or Sega AM1 and wasn't as focused on the arcades as its previous iteration, making many ports and original games for home markets. They later merged briefly with Overworks, another Sega studio, to form Sega WoW before splitting up and reviving the Sega AM1 brand. They made some great arcade machines, such as a personal favourite of mine, the Golden Axe sequel, The Revenge of Death Adder, but I've not included any of those unless they were re-released for home markets. So if I could only take 7 games to a desert island by WoW Entertainment, or whichever name they were using at the time, these are the ones I would choose. Released on Christmas Day 2003 in Japan and brought to the West in 2004, Sega GT Online is essentially a special edition of Sega GT 2002, which was originally intended for release on the Dreamcast, but instead became a launch title for the original Xbox. While the online features are no longer applicable, this version does contain 40 new cars, as well as new tracks, modes and options. While this game isn't going to scratch my burnout itch, having cars that take no physical damage and reward you for completing races with no collisions, it's not a true racing sim and feels more like a Ridge Racer game. There is also a Chronicle mode where you level up classic cars in an attempt to compete with modern sports cars, quick races for pick up and play, timed modes to challenge yourself, and a video playback mode to relive some of your best runs. While there are plenty of fighting games I could have chosen that I would probably enjoy more, there'll be room for them later on the list, so a decent driving game provides some nice variety. I found this game reasonably priced online and ordered it from a Japanese store. This was entirely down to Joe and Dave over at GameSack showcasing it in their wrestling games episode. Much as the US were dominated by the big 2 wrestling companies of WWF and WCW in the 1990s, Japan's main 2 were New Japan Pro Wrestling run by Antonio Inoki and All Japan Pro Wrestling run by Shoei Giant Baba. This AJPW licensed game contains a large roster of their most popular wrestlers of the era, both Japanese and foreign gaijin from the West, such as the recently deceased Vader. The game also had legends such as Bruiser Brody, Stan Hansen and Bruno Sammartino in his only video game appearance, not counting WWE 2K14 DLC. It's always good when I can get a wrestling game on my list, especially one with such a big and varied roster. This game has very nice graphics and presentation and a fun arcade style of gameplay. The controls and strategy can take a time to master, especially with the Japanese menus and instruction booklet, but it doesn't mar the play value. With plenty of time to trial and error the menus and settings, more modes and features could be uncovered. Simply named Dororo in Japan, this game is based on the manga strip and animated series of the same name by legendary Astro Boy creator, the father of anime, Tezuka Osamu. I was tempted to put Skies of Arcadia on this list because of its long playtime and popular reputation, but I couldn't get invested in the characters and don't generally go for RPG games. I know that's controversial, but that's why these lists are my personal choices rather than definitive best game lists. I chose Blood Will Tell because it contains many of the levelling up tropes of a more action-oriented RPG without too much of the fine-tuning. The story itself is completely wacky, with you playing a man trying to recover his lost body parts which were given to demons by his father in a dark pact. In place of your standard limbs, you have blades and weapons you can use to fight those who oppose you on your quest to find yourself. Literally. There's a reason why game controllers have remained fundamentally unchanged since the days of the NES. They may be more ergonomic and have more buttons these days, but they function in essentially the same way, because they work perfectly for almost every kind of game. But sometimes a different controller can add a whole new level of involvement into a game, and maybe none so much as holding a gun in your hand. The official Wii Zapper has its detractors, but there are plenty of third-party alternatives available to turn your humble Wii remote into a rifle or hand cannon. This 2-pack contains the incredibly cheesy House of the Dead 2, featuring some of the worst dialogue in video game history, and the much improved House of the Dead 3. While these are hardly the most cerebral of video games, the arcade feel and crazy zombie blasting make for a fun dip in and out game to pass the time. I was originally tempted to put House of the Dead 3 for the original Xbox on this list, partly because it's less controversial being a single game, and partly because it used a real light gun controller as opposed to the Wii's emulation of one using the Wii remote in conjunction with the sensor. I opted for this version eventually because I haven't actually played the Xbox version, and getting House of the Dead 2 for free seemed like a no-brainer, pun intended. House of the Dead meets pinball in what may have seemed like an odd combination when it was released, but we're talking about the same company that brought out Typing of the Dead, a variant where you use a keyboard to input words shown on screen to kill zombies rather than use a gun, and the in-game characters even carry keyboards instead of firearms and wear Dreamcasts on their backs like proton packs. The menu screen presents you with an arcade interior with 3 pinball machines, each based on different levels from the House of the Dead games. Despite that, this game is much more of a video pinball game than an attempt to simulate real-world tables. They each contain multiple playfields on the same vertical level, much like Devil's Crush and other 90s games of the type. There are also animated characters moving across the playfield, in this case zombies. While the Game Boy Advance does offer a small viewable playing area and dated graphics, the pick up and play nature of pinball games and their endless format gives them great longevity. Yes, seriously, a fishing game. I like to think I have eclectic tastes when it comes to video games, and even genres I don't usually like tend to feature at least one exception, such as the golf game Neo Turf Masters, and this is my go-to angling game. While most fishing games tend to have a slow and methodical pace, this bright and lively arcade port is nothing of the sort. Instead of trying to get the biggest bass or some other nondescript fish, this game has you capturing a variety of exotic sea life, including bluefin marlin, barracuda, coelacanths and mako sharks, all accompanied by some energetic rock tunes to beef up the tension. There are plenty of collectibles to unlock, such as outfits and lures, and you can even manage your own aquarium. There are mini-games, timed modes, the original arcade game, and free-to-play, where you can just fish however you want. While I'm sure the game is functional with a standard controller, I've only ever played this with the Dreamcast fishing rod peripheral, where you cast the rod over your head and then use the incremental reel to pull the fish in at just the right speed. Dynamite Decker was a Japanese beat-em-up arcade game that was ported to the West with a movie license attached, rebranding it as Die Hard Arcade. When the sequel arrived, it had lost the Die Hard name and came to us as Dynamite Cop. The plot is not too dissimilar to Namco's Time Crisis, where you must rescue the president's daughter, albeit from pirates instead of terrorists. The action takes place aboard a cruise ship as you battle your way through waves of some of the most outlandish and quirky characters I've ever seen in a video game. There are guys dressed in loincloths, wearing turtle or lobster shells, and a chef who throws carrot bombs. As you may have guessed, realism isn't exactly paramount in this game, as it takes multiple hits at close range with a rocket launcher to take out a basic minion, or you can beat him to death with a baguette without even bending or breaking it. The whole thing has a cinematic feel to it, if you count cheesy B-movie action films as cinematic, and there are rudimentary QuickTime events between the levels which add atmosphere. Despite only covering a small part of Sega's rich history, this studio managed to put out some truly enjoyable games without a blue hedgehog in sight.
no problem, StreakyGeek. I wish you the best of luck.